Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to day 204 of Humanity Rising. Every day over the past year or so, we have been coming to you with partners from all over the world to provide an open space so that as we traverse this extraordinary pandemic together, we can commune and build community, share our concerns, our visions, and in particular, as world of events unfold, we can take note and seek to discern deeper meanings in unfolding technical, economic, political, and cultural events. Today, we are going to turn to the issue of race. One of the most extraordinary aspects of the pandemic is that when Breonna Taylor was killed 1 year ago this past Saturday, on the 13th of March, 2020, and then when George Floyd was killed on May 25th, the world was ignited around the issue of race. And it is to this issue that we will turn today. Before we do that, let us gather ourselves as we always do. Let us center ourselves in our bodies. Take a few deep breaths. Close our eyes. And center our attention on our heart. See if you can just listen to your heartbeat. In a spirit of deep gratitude and thanksgiving that you're alive. We're all alive at this extraordinary moment in the human journey. Thank you, everyone. Now with a full heart full of gratitude for each and every one of you that are joining our session today, I want to commence our program by just reminding us what happened to Breonna Taylor. She was asleep in her apartment with her boyfriend, and without warning, without a knock on the door, Police officers burst into the room, apparently on some drug search, which never uncovered anything. And before anyone knew what had happened, Breonna Taylor, still in her bed, was riddled with 5 bullets and was dead. And that event ignited consternation and protest and outrage. Her boyfriend has now filed a major lawsuit based on the Fourth Amendment, protection against unreasonable search and seizure. It was just, unfortunately, one of many. And shortly thereafter, about 2 months later, as we all know, because we all bore witness, when a white police officer put his knee on the neck of George Floyd. And George Floyd, gasping, "I can't breathe. I can't breathe," until he died. And that YouTube went viral worldwide. And maybe it was because the pandemic has been about breathing. Maybe it was because of the poignancy of watching for nearly 9 minutes an unarmed man on the ground being asphyxiated, that the world ignited. Protests ignited all over the United States and around the world. And it was apparently the largest number of protests and the largest number of people ever to protest in history. After centuries of racism and slavery, discrimination, oppression, some way the issue of race and how we human beings, who all look alike, who all act alike, who are all part of the same species and love alike and feel alike, with superficial differences between us, even at the level of culture. We are all one humanity. And yet somehow, particularly in countries like the United States, with its deep history of servitude and racism, we can't quite come to the point where we acknowledge the most obvious thing in the world, that we are one. And that it is our diversity that actually unites us as one. So it's with deep appreciation for my good friend and colleague, Dr. Cuff Ferguson, that I want to now turn over the program. Cuff has been a regular on Humanity Rising. We've gotten to know each other. He took his PhD in psychology from Boston College. He's been a tenured professor and dean at the University of Massachusetts in Boston, been a clinical practitioner for over 35 years. He's been the president many times, or co-president of the Association of Humanistic Psychology, that you may recall was founded by Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers back in 1962. In 2006, Cuff became the first African-American president of that association, a position he's held continuously in various forms since then. He's also an author. He has founded a number of organizations and continues to be perennially active in the issue of multicultural relations and humanistic psychology, both as a practitioner, a theoretician, and an activist. So Cuff, I'm warmly welcoming you to the program. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jim. It's such a pleasure to be here today and to share in this experience and the commonality of humanity. And what we're going to be trying to do is to, with my panelists, is to try to see if we can take a deep dive into understanding the nature of racism. And we've chosen as a theme the whole question of undoing racism and trying to do this using a particular framework that I call archetypal energies. So our title or the theme of our talks and experiences together is Undoing Racism, Archetypal Energies, Race Relations, and Decolonizing the Anti-Black Racist Mind. Now, we all know that racism can happen and does happen in many different forms, and that there's anti-Asian racism going on currently, and other forms of racism. But one of the more profound and deep kind of wounds that's been happening for humanity has to do with anti-Black racism. And we want to give special attention to that, since it is very core to the nature in which the United States was founded, and indeed to many of the aspects of the world that currently exist. So what I want to do is to initially introduce the folks who are going to be with me today. And then I am going to do a little sharing about this framework in a large way and a very broad way. And then we're going to try to see if we can have some words from each of the panelists, and then we will proceed, from there, hopefully to have a little bit of time for some discussions afterwards. Now, so I'm going to ask Joyce and Yvette and Kevin to turn on your cameras so I can introduce you. I don't see Kevin. Oh, Kevin is here. Okay.
I prompted him, Cuff. There he is.
Oh, okay, here we go. So I just want to say a little bit about who they are. It's really basically about talking about the roles they play in the world. And then I'm going to see if we can do a little playful thing by having you to watch a little video clip as a way to begin to talk about the whole subject of racism and undoing racism. It has a little humorous form to it, because sometimes this is a very heavy topic to try to explore, but humor can go a long way in trying to do a deep dive around it. So Yvette Weston is with us today. She is a writer, she's a poet, she's an activist, and her works appear in a number of different places. She's also a founder and executive director of Esquetro Diaspora Afro in Boston. And she also is the diaspora coordinator of an important organization. It's an international network of Afro-Latin American women. And she's a commissioner of the National African Reparations Commission, and is also a co-founder of a regional council of people of African descent from Latin America and the Caribbean. So I think her descriptions actually can be found in some of the text around this particular session. Dr. Joyce Hope Scott is also with us. She's a clinical professor of African American Studies at Boston University. She's a former scholar of the Oxford Roundtable and former Fulbright Senior Professor to Burkina Faso and the Republic of Benin in West Africa. She's a co-founder and co-director of the International Network of Scholars and Activists for African Reparations. And she also is president of the Boston Pan-African Forum, and a number of other accolades that are too long to list at the moment. And then we have Kevin Peterson with us today, and he's a founder and executive director of the New Democracy Coalition, which is a nonpartisan and a nonprofit organization that focuses on civic engagement in Massachusetts, as well as across the United States. He's currently involved in he founded the Faneuil Hall Race and Reconciliation Project, which we'll be talking about a little bit later. One of the things that we want to try to do is to give some glimpses into some of the work that people have been doing to try to undo racism locally, nationally, and internationally. So that's kind of like what we want to try to do. We have also like a little film at the end that we're gonna see if we can share with you. So with that said, what I'm gonna ask is, Rick, if you could tee up the little video, we'll do a little share around that.
Ready to go.
Yeah.
Oh, I hate having a birthday during Black History Month. Why do I only get a day when they get an entire month?
You're so smart, babe.
You know what we really need? We need a White History Month.
Did someone say that there should be a White History Month?
Yeah, how'd you know?
Let me guess, you're not racist or anything, but you just think it'd be better if we didn't have a Black History Month in America at all.
Yeah, pretty much.
Ugh, let's get this over with.
And then Chadwick wins cribbage.
It's Mandy and I. Why are we dressed so lame? And what are those stupid shoes? Why is everything so different?
Well, you see, Chad, without Black inventors, our world would have missed out on huge advancements in cell phone technology, gaming consoles, and personal computers. Not to mention important shoemaking techniques, light bulbs that last more than a few days, and delicious, delicious potato chips. A world without Black history is completely different.
Yeah, but all that stuff would have gotten invented anyway.
If all inventions are inevitable, then why celebrate any inventors, Chad?
Wait, where's Grandpa? Grandpa's dead?
Yes. Not only did a Black engineer help invent the pacemaker, but the first successful open heart surgery was done by a Black surgeon, so... But Black history is not just about technology. So, what do you feel like listening to? Classical, Irish step dancing, polka music, an entire crooner station, more classical.
Okay, I see what you're doing here. Just put on Elvis and I'll be good.
Elvis who?
Fine, I walked right into that. Kenny Chesney or something.
Ooh, sorry, dude. Country music has its roots in black R&B, which means a world without black history is a world without country music.
No! This place is lame. Where are we?
Times Square, Midtown Manhattan. Ever heard of it?
Yeah, right. There's more like some boring town and some little country or something.
Pretty much. Not only was most of early New York City built by African slaves, but without black slaves, the South never developed its labor-intensive cotton and tobacco plantations.
What?
Which means that the North never developed its financial sector or heavy industries meant to support that very same lucrative cotton industry.
What?
It's entirely possible that without the contributions of black Americans, we wouldn't have the money to have made the Louisiana Purchase from France.
What?
The land deal that expanded America's borders and catapulted it into being one of the world's leading food producers, as well as a global leader.
Wait, so you're saying that without black people, most of this country is owned by France?
It's entirely possible.
No! No! Take me back! I want to go back! I want to go back! What month is it?
February.
Specifically!
Black History Month?
Oh, thank God. Happy Black History Month, Grandpa. Happy Black History Month potato chip. Happy Black History Month cell phone. Happy Black History Month hip hop and streetwear apparel. God bless Black History Month.
Black History Month? You just said there should be a white history rule. Okay.
I'm woke now. Okay, fine. Beastie Boys.
Okay.
Absolutely.
All right. That was kind of a way of introducing the whole issue of race and Black race in particular from the lens of the United States, and the importance of the role that we played in the creation of the experience of the United States. And so what I want to try to do from here is I want to give a little talk around the framework. And so I'm going to talk for a little bit and before we get into any kind of discussion. So I want to do a screen share. If I can pull it up to talk about. I have a very slow computer, by the way. So we're going to be talking about this whole question of archetypal energies as a framework for undoing racism.
Cuff, could you make that full screen? It's the little thing in the right corner down there.
Yeah, it's trying to come up.
Okay, you're good. Thanks.
Okay. So what we're going to be trying to do, or is to talk about this whole question of archetypal energy as a framework for undoing racism and decolonizing the anti-Black racist mind and optimal race relations, individually and collectively. When I was putting together these slides, I realized that actually we could spend probably a whole full session on each one of them. But so I'm going to run through them very quickly, and perhaps we can, those who enter into the chat, we can have some further discussions about it. What I'm going to be talking about is a little bit about, this is where some of the things that which kind of grounded my experience. I grew up in the segregated South with all of what that means. having to sit on the back of the bus, seeing signs labeled colored and white. And what it did, however, is to introduce me to a number of different ways of thinking about that experience. I'm also going to be pulling a little bit from trying to understand the nature of our color code that we use in the United States, and pulling from actually a essay I wrote way back in 1970 when I got angry about different kinds of psychologists that I was experiencing. And I wrote a whole little piece on Toward a Black Psychology of Black Mental Health. There were some consciousness expanding experiences that I had in my early 20s. And no, I wasn't using LSD or anything of that nature, but it was an experience which allowed me to be able to really experience the oneness of everything around me. People, the environment, everything was experienced as one. And it caused me to have some questions about things. But what are we talking about when we talk about this whole experience here? This experience, early experiences, actually left me with two questions. What are aspects of the colonized anti-Black racist mind? And it also left me with the question of what happens to the concept of self if ideas around race, the nature of consciousness, the nature of the unconscious, self-creation, and reincarnation. What if you married all of those ideas? Where would that take you? And it took me into a deep dive around looking at things from a spiritual and soul-centered perspective. The first dive was around doing some research, and that led to a book called A New Perspective on Race and Color. If people aren't aware of it, we have a color code that exists. And all I have to do is to say the color and you know what racial group I'm talking about. So of course, if I say white, you know what white, I'm talking about the Caucasian race. If I say black, I'm talking about African Americans. If I say brown, you know what race I'm talking about. Yellow and red are the color codes. It's not so much that the color codes are the issue, it's the meanings that we attach to them. So this research was a way to try to get at that. And it turned out that there were some profound things that came out of that research, particularly having to do with the issue of the nature of death as a trigger for how many white folks began to think about race relations, particularly Black-white race relations. And that was an interesting find. I didn't expect to find that. Did another deep dive. And by the way, when we talk about color, it really doesn't have anything to do with the reality of the situation. Because the modal color of white actually is pinkish tan. The modal color of Black folks really is not so much black, but it's brownish. So the reality doesn't match up with the actual experience of color, but we failed to celebrate that miracle of being able to see color in and of itself. Transition and Consciousness was a deep dive, trying to look at what happens to us over many years. And I'm not going to go into detail around that because it's going to take up too much time. But here are things that we began to discover around the colonized anti-Black racist mind. One is that it's prone to fear in the nature of the unconscious, fearing the nature of death, and viewing them as the dark, unknown aspects of the self that must be contained. It's also prone to use anti-Black race-linked projection and fear that's generated by unexamined self-limiting beliefs, which then get directed toward the Black race or darker complexioned people. It shows a preference or desirability for whiteness and cultural values, behaviors, and physical appearances. and objects and derivatives of the West. It's mostly Western Europe and the USA, and with a disdain and undesirability for anything coming from the non-West. It's also prone to consciously or unconsciously use anti-Black dispositions to create these systems, these laws, rules, policies, practices, and also self and cultural narratives in order to maintain a sense of this illusion of white privilege, manifest destiny, and having power over the environment and colonized people with darker complexions. This is the book that was recently put together, and it's really about the spiritual and soul-centered perspective. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the ideas that's contained in this, and then I'm going to see if I can do this fast. I know that I'm not doing it justice. So, but what is this framework for undoing racism and optimal race relations? These are just some generic concepts. Racism here is being defined as a belief that race is a fundamental determinant of human traits, capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. So racism occurs when unjust social structures are produced by the failure to account for race in and of itself. So it has a kind of a worldview perspective to it. And the actions of a race is supported, tend to support the continuance of this kind of racially imbalanced system of power and privilege. What we discovered is that in this framework, undoing racism can only be done when people understand what it is, where it comes from, how it functions, and why it's perpetuated. Okay. So what are these archetypal energies? Define archetypal energies as higher vibrational energies that operate deep within our psyches at individual and collective levels. And each archetypal energy has its own transcendent value, purpose, and quality, and it's unique to the individual. So when we talk about them, and I'm just going to relay them very quickly as I move on, we tend to experience them as creative urges that move us toward our optimal selves and optimal realities. And so after studying them and looking at them across cultures and looking at them from an energy perspective, I use easily recognized terms to evoke a common sense of what they are. And there are about 25 of them. Things like love, compassion, that we all know about, but they're experienced very uniquely by each of us. So if I say, for example, I love you, and you know what that means for you, I love you simply means that when I'm in your presence, vibrationally, I'm in touch with the love inside of me. Same with all of these archetypal energies. And they tend to lead us toward our optimal selves and optimal realities. So here's the perspective around them. That we know that everything around us is simply made of energy. So we live in an energy vibrational world. Einstein told us that. If we were, in fact, to literally be able to run the speed of light twice over, we would turn into pure energy. And that's what this formula actually is telling us. So we're 4-4 beings, consciousness energy beings with a mind, a body, an emotion, and a spirit. And when we look at the mind, we see it as the carrier of beliefs. Beliefs structure reality at both individual and collective levels. But beliefs are not truths. Beliefs are simply thoughts reinforced by emotion and imagination. We also know now that thoughts and emotions have electromagnetic properties. And when we allow these creative urges to flow more freely, then we manifest our optimal selves and optimal realities. When we block them, then we create problems, particularly as they get diverted through our over-identification with some aspect of ourselves to the exclusion of others. In this framework, consciousness is defined this way. And again, I'm not going to read through all of these, but these will be posted on Ubiverse. But consciousness is kind of like it's not just a mirror of consensus reality. It's more like a source of manifestation of a spectrum of realities. There are three types of archetypal energies that I've discovered over the years. One are called foundational archetypal energies, and these help each person to form and establish a personality structure, a foundation, which has qualities that allow the person to entertain the possibility of growing, to expand, to move higher, and to do so by choosing a path of growth with joy. These are some of them. Trust that we know about, enthusiasm. And we started off today with one called humor. Transformational archetypal energies. These are the ones which have to do with changing our foci and our preferences of our consciousness and the nature of various blendings and transformations and transcendence and transmutations of a person's energy as the person makes authentic contact with deeper parts of themselves and as people make authentic contact with one another. Love, acceptance, inclusion, harmony help us to transform. And there's some spiritually integrative archetypal energies, which again, we won't go into detail around, but they each have certain vibrational qualities to them. They each are experienced in certain ways by each person uniquely, and we express them in our own unique ways. The paradigms that are at play. Here's the old paradigm. You and the material world somehow separate, based on the idea here that because we are separate, you're separate from the material world, somehow you can know it objectively, and that which is known, you can try to control. The new paradigm places you and the material world in this kind of interchange of energy. And there's an interdependence that's governed by certain energy principles. And there's about 7 of them, which we won't go into detail right now. In this framework also suggests that we live simultaneously in 3 life spaces: a personal life space, a societal life space, and a global life space. And they intersect through the way in which we experience our conscious mind. When somebody asks you who you are, usually we say something along these lines in terms of our race and gender and class and religion and culture and ethnicity and tribes and nationality. But we express these archetypal energies through these lenses. And so we will talk about ourselves in these ways. 3 domains of the self, of the lower self, which is the domain of our ego and personality, and the true self, really, which is an emerging self. It's the bridger for these transformations. And we have the higher self, which is the domain of essence and spirituality, a spiritually integrative self, which is where these archetypal energies emerge from. some people have talked about this as the morphic field. Now we're playing seven different kind of games, but the ones that where we are stuck right now is with the security human race game, the sensory human race game, and the power human race game, which is one of the biggest ones that's at play right now. However, through playing these human race games, they can be transformed. And again, I won't get into detail around that right now, but some of the work for undoing racism has to do with trying to transform the security race game, the sensory human race game, and the power race game. And I'm going to skip through all of these. Much of this actually is contained in that book, in the little book that I referenced earlier, so I'm not going to go through these things. I did want to reference, however, that when we are playing these and acting out these race games, these are three common ways in which these things have been played out: through the bully victim role, the pursuer distancing role, and the parent-child role. But we can evolve toward playing these roles in different ways, through the inspirational race game, the altruistic race game, and what we're calling the soul source race game. This is how you will know if you're acting out of your higher self. And again, I won't go into all of these. There's certain, there are about 7 harmonious relationship principles, however, that we can get into when we perhaps have a discussion later on. But the 7 principles that can help us to transform has to do with these, the principles that relate to certain laws of energy. For example, the reality principle is that we create our reality according to the nature of our beliefs. So it's important then to adopt win-win beliefs and attitudes. That has to do with the law of attraction. There's the law of polarity, which is the dualistic consciousness that we find ourselves in, and the law of neutrality, which is one of the ones where if you're not clear about what you want to do, use that particular law in terms of how you use your energy. Of course, we know about the law of consequences, the law of intention, and the law of allowing, and the law of universality. All of those are part of principles that I play at an energy level, which again will require a lot more time to unfold and discuss. Power of yes and no. These 2 words are very powerful, because when you say yes to something, to a person, event, or experience, you literally pointing your consciousness in a certain direction. If you say no to the same person, circumstance, you're literally pointing your consciousness in another direction. And that point of choosing is the point of power for yes and no. So for example, if people chose not to be here today, literally at this very moment, we would have an entirely different reality going on. So what's currently interfering with people getting in touch with these archetypal energies? One is that there's an age-old wound in the human psyche that requires healing. It's been festering since humans became aware of being aware. And this age-old wound is related to humanity's past and present inability to sort of comprehend, to appreciate perceived human distinctions and the differences at individual and collective levels. This age-old wound is also related to humanity's attempt to make meaning out of its awareness of and experience with light and dark. Light and dark. There's a strong association then, based on empirical studies that I've done, where dark gets associated with the nature of the unconscious, the unknown, and the Black race. That association then gets projected out when people fear the nature of their inner life and the nature of the unconscious. So that wound has been with us for many, many centuries, almost from the beginning of time. As we know about and learn more and more about what's called dark matter, when we begin to understand that a bit more deeply, perhaps we'll begin to understand a little bit more about what's behind that wound in the human psyche. Here are some roles that people can play as agents for humanity rising. The relationship builder role, harmonizer role, the transformer catalyst role, the illuminator teacher role, and the spiritual integrator and healer role. Again, these things will be posted, so I won't go into detail. As I mentioned, you can take any one of these slides here and do an entire session on. And here are some tools that we're currently using. We started off by using the tool of humor. And these are also discussed somewhat in the book, Evolving the Human Race Game. So I won't go into detail around those. And what I will kind of end with is this whole notion that the recognition that we're all interdependent as racial human beings on the planet Earth. This is one of the outgrowths from this framework for undoing racism and decolonizing the anti-Black racist mind. There's an African proverb that says, I am because we are, and we are because I am. And I'm going to suggest that our next evolutionary step is really one of learning how to grow with joy. We already know how to grow with pain. We got our PhDs in learning how to grow with pain. Well, we don't know how to grow with joy at the moment. So I'm going to suggest that's our next evolutionary step. And there's some visions that I've encountered as we have been talking about this. And one of them has to do with, and again, I won't have time to go into detail around this, but the three visions that have emerged in terms of where we may be going as human beings. One vision has to do with humanity as a telepathic species. Another vision has to do with the gift of the visible aura for humanity, learning to see our auras, the energy fields around us. We already have technology that allows us to do that. And then some people also have that gift. And then the third vision has to do with the maturation of consciousness through spiritualizing the material world and soul linking. So I'm going to end there because we could go on and on and on. So let me see if we can stop share here. Okay, that's a mouthful for everybody. I'm going to turn to Yvette and ask you to, if you have any thoughts that you want to share about this whole topic of undoing racism and ways in which you have been going about doing it. Yvette, you're on. I think you're muted.
Yes, and I'm actually going to go with our African practice in this moment and say thank you to you as my elder for inviting me and handing it over first and foremost to my elder, Mama Joyce to speak before me, and have her wisdom guide my response. So I don't know, Mama Joyce, I'm going to hand that to you and ask your permission to speak first, and I mean for you to speak before me. Thank you.
Okay, Ashe.
Ashe.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy actually that I have an opportunity to speak after you, Cuff, because I'm sitting here thinking as you're speaking, and we've talked, and I know the level of agreement and commonalities that we have in the way we think and conceptualize things. So I'm going to say this. Let's start with the end of the world. Why don't we? Okay. And starting at the end of the world is this one, and looking at the beginning of another one, the old one. So in the beginning, Nanabuluku had a thought. That thought became Ashe, energy, vibration. And from that Ashe became creation, the creation of the forces of nature, that represent creativity, that's created mankind, the ancestors, and from there, the rest of the world. So let's begin with the end of the world and with the reestablishment of that notion. The idea that all things come from Ashe prohibits racism altogether. There's no way that we can think about divisions, arbitrary and capricious divisions like that, with a notion of that type. That belongs to a category which we call rematriation, or African traditional knowledge. Okay. This is foundational. It's fundamental to understand what has happened to us. And when I'm saying us, I'm talking about humanity. I'm not going to divide us into that thing called races to talk about the resolution of anti-racism. I can't talk about it in that sense. All right. So with that being an image of unity and order and oneness that represents our connection to the universe and to all other things created. And let me just add, all things have that Ashe, because it's a concept of procreation and not of making, or blacksmith style of making something, which is a concept that the Abrahamic religions will seem to imbibe to some large degree. So when you have the idea that something is procreated, that all things are connected. So the group of people that are in question here, i.e. those that we've called Black people or African Americans, whatever terms we want, and we've labeled them as Black, and we've created Blackness to go along with this. This is the first violation against the notion of Ashe, to create something called Blackness and whiteness, and particularly in the service of geological gain, profit making, and so on and so forth. The idea of turning somebody into a source of a commodity, an item that can be used to advance an agenda that one group of people have. In the process of doing that, something very, very vital happened. And it's something we don't talk about. And Cuff mentioned it a minute ago. We talked about that wound, but I want to expand that idea of a wound further. Actually, a colleague of mine from the University of Ghana, Legon, Dr. Kofi Anyadoho, explained to my students, because I take students to West Africa very often, and he gave a lecture and he said that, listen, the failure to talk about the trafficking in human beings, which is the origin of this destabilization and this wound that I'm going to talk about. He said it's like a wound that scar tissue has grown over. And because scar tissue has grown over it, we've erased it, even from our memory. from our conversation. And that is the kind of wound, he said, that is likely to kill you if you don't open it up and let the infection that's in there brewing come out. So for me, before we can talk about eradicating racism and reuniting as a human species, we've got to recognize what we've done to humanity. Okay, because in the process of creating this thing called race and privilege and all these other kinds of things, we wound up violating a fundamental principle of Nanabuluku, that story that I just gave you. And that is the ancestors, the role of ancestors. Okay, we have killed hundreds of millions of ancestors, and I'll just talk about Africans right now, but we'll talk about others as well, as you know, in the process of building colonialism, the colonial world. And I want to address the colonial, anti-colonial issue here. Okay. All those we know we have from legacies. Well, there were probably 12 million that came over here, and all these things we say so loftily in our, in our brilliance as scholars and so on and so forth, but we don't talk about, and we can't possibly understand how many we lost that didn't come here. All right. Something in this paradigm that I'm talking about, since Ashe is important, there's no such thing as Ashe disappearing and dissolving and becoming irrelevant anymore. So the Ashe of these murdered ancestors, whatever, is there. Okay, it's still there. And so there must be a redress, i.e., a reciprocal recognition and a reciprocity to deal with that infraction that's cosmic. Now, the United Nations talks about it as a crime against humanity, and that's fine. That's exactly what it was, all these other kinds of terms. But we're talking, and I'm thanking Kof for this, is putting it into the level where it needs to be, and that is a spiritual level. We have violated some fundamental spiritual laws and aspects of behavior as beings in this creation, where everything is linked by this initial Ashe. Okay, so we have to recognize that and understand it. So the idea that people are throwing around as, which is inadequate, to say reparations, to say restitution, to say any terms like that are miss the mark, essentially, miss the mark, because it's an ancestral issue. It's an ancestral issue for so-called white people. It's an ancestral issue for so-called Black people. It's an ancestral issue for the people that were lost in the genocidal plunders of this continent and other continents, as colonial structures were set in place, and capitalism as a driving force of the global world today was set in place, and so on. So all of these infractions are problematic. And when I asked one of my colleagues, I asked a spiritual leader in Africa, I said, what is the name, or is there a name of a divinity or a force that guides what we call racism? And he says, oh, yes. The divinity is called, or the force is Domindo. It's not a term I had ever heard of before, Domindo. But Domindo is like Zambeto. Zambeto is a force generated from Ashe. In other words, Ashe is not, it's like, I try to tell myself, it's like atomic energy or whatever. You split the atom, energy is there. I mean, we could have decided to just desalinate a lot of ocean so everybody would have clean water. We could have used it to try to rebuild the Sahara so everybody could have food to eat. But we chose to do something else with it, which I don't have to name, like destroy cities and so on and so forth. But it's still the same power. Okay. So it's a matter of what we do with that. And in order to do anything with it, we have got to acknowledge and recognize and sit down and say grace or whatever terminology we want to say over the infraction that has happened, first of all, and make an attempt to rectify it, to ask to deal with those with the infraction that we've done. I keep saying I because I'm a part of the human race. And I'm not going to use the them and I kind of paradigm. Okay, so this is at many different levels. Obviously, the idea that we can't arbitrarily and capriciously decide to make races out of something that is human. All right, we've done it, it's there, and so we deal with it. All right, we have to deal with it. But we, just as we created it and configured it, just in the same way that we decided that we were going to legally construct the Black body as something to be owned, over which others had authority, which could be dragged around, which could be whose children could be taken, or all the other kinds of things that I don't need to go into. That just as we decided to make that category of one part of humanity and make another part of humanity the profiteers or beneficiaries of that, it was a rhetorical, it was a linguistic, it was a discursive thing that happened. Okay, discourse has to be transformed. Okay, and truth has to be encoded in that discourse of what have we done? What story did we create? All right, and how do we interrogate that story and deconstruct it or disrupt it so that we can move forward? It is the story that guided us to where we are now. Okay, and it is a story that we are separate from nature, that has allowed us to distance ourselves, and to have a point in time where now the great Oneli is calling us to task to give an account for the way we've dissed our mother. Okay, so in the very idea of setting up colonial structures and dragging people as enslaved folks to do it and taking the land from indigenous people, we managed to create all these separations, which the discourse then created behind it to help justify, elaborate it, and pass it on into perpetuity to our children and ourselves, to have us wind up where we are today. This is why we can have a Breonna Taylor. This is why we can have a George Floyd. Okay, a Michael Brown. This is because of the discourse that we've created about who these beings are or not. In other words, we've got to change that kind of thing before anything else happens. All right. So I'm a professor like Cuff, and I could rattle on and on, but I don't want to do that. And because I thank my daughter, Yvette, for giving me the time. But I just want to talk about one of the things that I'm doing on an international basis to try to readdress this issue. I know I don't have to tell any of you that in 2014, the United Nations declared this decade up until 2024 the decade of African descended people. All right, and so what does that mean? They have three themes that they put forth at that time. The first one was recognition, and then restitution and development or whatever. Okay. So because I think that while I'm talking about an ideological notion here, well, we could be called idiot, but I don't think there's anything ideological about spirit. It's real about the spiritual. There is something on the practical level that, or I guess let me just say on the visceral level that I am engaged in, which I think is important, and it has the potential for making some healing and some strategies forward for anti-Black racism, especially in this particular point in time. At the heart of this is two notions. One is called rematriation, and the other is planetary repairs. And I just want to bring up, if I'm lucky, this little, okay, PowerPoint. Which talks about the International Network of Scholars and Activists for African Reparations. And it is indeed a group of, just as it says, scholars and activists who are concerned about repair and so on and so forth. And I'm not going to just linger on each one of these things. I want to move through it, and maybe we'll have a chance to talk about it later on if folks are interested in that. It's rooted in this praxis of decolonization, pluriversality, and cognitive justice. That's the idea of equality for all knowledges, i.e. African indigenous knowledge being at the forefront of the notion we talk about rematriation. And so we talk about here that the descendants of enslaved and their communities are not just harmed, they continue to be harmed by what is referred to as the maangamizi. That is the idea of a continued ongoing repercussions of enslavement and colonization. So in other words, a part of this new humanity, the idea of eradicating anti-Black racism is recognizing that these structures are still in place. And this is why I've said earlier that there's some reckoning that needs to be done relative to that point. So what we tried to do here is look at exactly what we're saying, looking at the equality of knowledges, which is known as cognitive justice, having scholars and activists involved in this, challenging misconceptions, like calling people slaves. These were regular people like you and me that were captured and trafficked, just like drugs, across the Atlantic. And that's what it was. There's no trade because nothing was being traded. You had human beings being trafficked. It's changing that discourse that I'm talking about here. And so a reparative vision, which goes into the discourse and so on. So because I'm an academic, but I consider myself also an activist, it's important that people who are at the forefront of this, what we're calling activists and scholars, come together on these points. One of the things I noticed with my European colleagues, particularly the ones in the United Kingdom, there seemed to be this breach, deep chasm between scholars and activists, and I didn't quite understand that, but since they proclaim that it is a feature, we focused a lot on that. And so these are some of the organizations: Pan-African Coalition for Reparations, of PARCO, and other kinds of groups that are national and international. Naturally, a group on youth organizations, which have to do with giving some recognition to the importance of cognitive justice. The things that we've had some kinds of events that help bring together the notion of rematriation, the notion of the role of ancestors and ancestral knowledge as a driving piece of this repair and restitution or atonement, if you want to call it, that needs to happen. And so we've had conferences, workshops, and so on in places like Birmingham, a city university in the UK, and we at Gorée Island in Senegal, which many of you know was one of the points of departure for captive Africans coming to the New World enslaved. And then we had other kinds of events. One of the most outstanding of those events was a conference held in the Republic of Benin, formerly the Kingdom of Dahomey. And out of that came the Porto Novo Declaration, which was signed by the traditional king, who is right here. Who's no longer, who's traveled to Alada. I can't say the word dead because that's not what you say about kings. So this is the declaration. As you can see, the work that we did there. I won't linger with it, but essentially what that declaration said, signed by the kings: we call upon African nations and African states and their diplomatic leaderships to join with civil society in order to formulate, policies and establish operational committees in order to institutionalize and advocate for the claim for reparatory justice for those countries that implemented the criminal globalization of chattel enslavement of Africans according to the principles of international law and the provisions of the United Nations with the International Decade of People of African Descent. And it's signed by His Majesty King Potuzome Hakpon III, who was there. So we've had publications which we put out again, and you can go to our website. I'll make this available for people who are interested in this. And what we've had some roundtables, again, working on looking at planet repairs, looking at the role of universities and the whole business of the slave trade and capitalist enterprise there connected to that. We talked about the role of these figures that and institutions that stand in representation of those who harmed others in the whole business of captivity, environmental racism, reparations, and planet repairs, which is all a part of what we're talking about in humanizing life going forward, miseducation. And what we have in terms of upcoming kinds of projects are the notions here of indigenous knowledge, community-led practices, which focus on rematriation is the term I'm using here. This is the retrieval of fundamental principles of West African cosmology, which is crucial to reestablishing links to the ancestral spiritualities, which transatlantic trafficking severed. It was a crime that is the crime against humanity that I would say is at question here. The spiritual links of ancestral links between the people and their is the same kind of concern that indigenous people raise when they say this land is our ancestral land. We need to be on this land because it allows us to be in touch with our ancestors. There's also that ashe that's there, that those vibrations that are there. So looking at life at the universe as a holistic body with vibrations of each thing, human as well as what we call non-human. This is all a part of what we mean by rematriation. This concept of reparative concepts, looking at rematriation, returning to which is rightly that which belongs to all people, not just those taken from Africa, but all people. And the other one, planetary, and a part of that is leading to the planetary repairs that we're talking about. You know, this concern with the ecocide, environmental and sustainable development that needs to happen, the planetary pieces of this, where our vibrations, where the ashe, where the ancestral links to the living and so on, and where healing can take place. Healing has to take place. And part of what we're doing now, we were funded again by the United Kingdom's Arts and Humanities Research Council, is making this documentary in Benin, which focuses on the cultural loss, diasporic return, the notion of rematriation, looking at spiritual sites, talking to traditional healers and traditional chefs spirituel of the traditions and so on and so forth. There's also will be workshops among the traditional kings of Ghana also organized, the Garfic Association in the eastern part of Ghana, which looks at training the young in the tradition and so on and so forth. This is a part of environmental as well as not only rematriation, but planetary repairs, which are important here. These activities demonstrate, we think, the impact of innovation, approaching reparations through these unexplored areas of culture, spirituality, environmentalism, away from the idea that a check can solve any of this, because that is not even possible. The creativity through video documentary making and sustained engagement through the community forced and focused workshops, where the idea is to promote the value of African knowledge systems. So I'm going to cut it off there and say that there is certainly an opportunity to speak more about this in our discussion, and I'm open to any questions and any input. But thank you so much. And Njuba, my daughter, Ashe, back over to you again.
Ashe, Mama Joyce. Um, yes, that's where you start. That's how you're supposed to start, in grounding ourselves in our ancestral sort of energy and Ashe. I give thanks to whose shoulders we stand on today. And so that we have time for discussion, because I really do think that's the base that Mama Joyce just spoke of. But then sort of speeding up is this notion of how deeply rooted this disruption has been. You know, I'm currently reading Dr. Claude Jr.'s book, Begin Again, where he places James Baldwin's work into what is happening today. And he begins by talking about one of the things that James Baldwin combated and spoke of and advocated on. And it's one of the things that I think all of us here, at least the panelists that I have had the pleasure of being guided and mentored by, is disrupting a lie. And the lie is so deeply rooted in our dehumanizing of our African self, of our African being, of everything Black, to the extent that anything that is going to bring light to that lie gets killed, like Breonna Taylor, and gets killed like George Floyd. And we talked about earlier about those names, but yesterday also was the anniversary of my colleague, Marielle Franco, who was assassinated on the streets of Brazil, coming out and doing the same thing that most Black women in the world as activists do, which is speak our truth. And she was gunned down in the street. So this is a world issue. This is so deeply rooted. The world has believed that Black is bad and white is good. And when we have to figure out how to fall into that lie, it means dehumanizing even those that look like you. And that's the perspective I bring as a Black Latina woman, from immigrant woman from Latin America, born and raised in Panama, where everybody knew they were Black. There was racism, but at least you knew you were Black. And then coming to this country and standing before those from Latin America who fall into this term Latino that was created in this country leaning into white supremacy and white privilege, that doesn't allow to have the African story be raised, and the African story that shaped the Americas, because there was a period in Panama in the 1500s that it was 5 Africans to 2 Europeans. So we shaped it, we built it. I sit here with great pride saying, you know, Panama created and was a point of entry for the Americas, for the Maroons and the Cimarrones that built it and developed it. But yet that lie, that disruption that happened, that allowed for the dehumanizing of us as African people, allowed those from Latin America and the Caribbean to say, no, I'm not Black, I'm Dominican. No, I'm not Black, I'm Puerto Rican. And allowed them to stand in this term that was created in this country that goes deeper into that separation by creating this terminology of brown, when we are Black in its development. Even if you are mixed, by using those terms, it continues to dilute the humanizing of the African presence in Latin America and the Caribbean, and the role that African plays in the development in the Caribbean beyond the food and the dance. So this lie, coming to this country and seeing how deeply rooted this lie is, and this colorism and this anti-Blackness, to stand in front of someone who is Black and telling you, no, I'm not Black, I'm Dominican, because they have managed to use their ethnicity and their culture as their way of defining their race because of their deeply rooted anti-Blackness, dehumanizing mindset that has landed on them, that doesn't allow them to even look at themselves in truth, in full and complete way, to say, yes, I'm Black and I'm proud. And it causes, you know, as also having a spiritual base, but also a clinical base. So very mentored by Cuff and Mama Joyce, is the psychological impact of it. So you have young people that we work with that are living schizophrenic lives because at home they are told, don't bring home a Black girlfriend. What is that Black music you're listening to? And these kids are Black. And they have to hear this every day in their homes. And then when they go outside and they get followed by the police, they're saying, Miss Yvette, we were being followed. I was like, what were you doing? Nothing. What were you saying? Nothing. You were having a Black experience. So the dehumanizing of themselves and who they are completely does not even allow them to see what is happening around them or to them. And how deeply rooted that is. You know, I was recently home in Panama, and give thanks. Today's my father's birthday for my father's transition, and today I celebrate him, and I know he's smiling because for 13 days being home, I lived with 13 days without racial microaggression. I didn't have to deal with anything that says you are less than. And in less than 2 hours getting on a flight from Miami to Boston, I was reminded of that with the behaviors around me, by the white woman who would refuse to move, you know, ask me to help me to move my bag, to the Latina woman that in helping her, she looks at me in Spanish and says, oh, I thought you were Black. You know, she's Black, but she associated her Blackness through me and not through her. And a flight attendant who would not help a woman with her children and bluntly said, this is not my job. So these everyday things that are happening are constant for those of us who walk with our eyes open, or as that video say, we are woke, that we have to lean into the spiritual practice that Mama Joy speaks about. We have to lean into the spiritual awareness and the energy that Cuff spoke about. Like, I know that there's folks' energy that I cannot be around. And I know that in the work that I do, I have to prepare myself and ground myself triple and double to enter into spaces to do the work that we do, because everything about the energy that I am about to face is against everything that I see of myself and humanize in myself. Because to be Black in the world, it's a constant work to find and lean into joy, because it is a definite act of resistance in the world that continues to dehumanize Africans, and especially those women whose shoulders I stand on, who guide me, and who I represent, because I do not move alone. So when we undo it, we have to shake it up. It has to be turned upside down, because we cannot continue to use the same tools that have been used to fix it, and it still can't be fixed. So I'll end there and hand it over to Kevin.
Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you may be, or good evening, wherever you may be in the world. I'm honored to have this privilege be a part of this esteemed panel led by Dr. Ferguson. To have been invited is something that's special to me. I've had the pleasure to be associated with at some point in time with each of the panelists, and each time I've gleaned information and knowledge and wisdom. It need not be said because it's somewhat obvious, but Cuff Ferguson, Dr. Ferguson, is planted on this earth as a person of possessing deep wisdom. I'm entirely absorbed by the work that he's been doing in terms of articulating the various archetypes and energies and the foundations upon which they are cited. Cuff highlighting love and acceptance and harmony and understanding are just so important as we think about the issue of race and moving forward. Dr. Joyce Scott, thank you for talking so clearly about decolonization and what that means, and particularly speaking to the issue of the force of racism. You mentioned Domendo. I want to explore that more with you and others, and how that is translated on the continent, and how we interpret it more specifically and work with it effectively here across the diaspora. And then Dr. Yvette, you're always such a pleasure to listen to, particularly as you expound upon the idea of, well, I should say the reality of our enforced divisiveness around the issue of Blackness as it exists, unfortunately, across continents and throughout the diaspora. The very importance of important task of talking about a Black identity as having some universal aspect is critical to our emancipation as a Black community in the diaspora, but also as a part of healing the world. Dr. Scott, more generally, more universally, Dr. Ferguson. I don't have a whole lot to say because much has been said about humanity rising with regard to the issue of race on this panel. I could only sort of comment because the themes have been set. I only wish to give a little testimony, as it were, from my perspective, my place as a Black Christian, and talk about how I think that identity illuminates the work, or perhaps better said, references the work of Dr. Ferguson and Dr. Scott and dear sister Dr. Yvette Modison. As a Black Christian, my work around emancipatory practices with regard to race and democracy stems out of the personal faith engagement with the cross, with Christ. Christ, the one who was crucified, and one to whom slaves identified as a sufferer, as the enslaved, transited the Atlantic into the so-called New World. They eventually encountered the God of their oppressor, and in an extraordinary epistemological practice of engagement, transformed the iconology and imagery of the Christ suffering into something more deep that, of course, articulated a personal, spiritual, cosmological function for them that related back to Africa, but also created something quite distinct as they were suffering in the diaspora, particularly within North America, particularly as they suffered in sites that I can relate to historically and geographically, at the Friendfield Plantation in Georgetown, South Carolina, where my family can trace some of its ancestors. Well, those enslaved people created a political theology, a Black political theology that illuminated the nation and eventually illuminated the world in different ways in terms of emancipation. Those enslaved coming out of the reality of suffering and trauma creates a certain kind of music that vibrates across the planet, creates a certain kind of literature. Yvette, you mentioned Baldwin and Eddie Glaude's magisterial book on Baldwin that I've had the opportunity to read recently. This part of Black theology that that is cited in an interpretation of Christian that creates a political theology, has created these things: a new literature, a different literature, a different musical format and mood, a different practical politics that we see in the lives of folks like Edward Du Bois and Frederick Douglass and Dr. King and Ida B. Wells and Rosa Parks and so many people in the United States have developed in terms of giving light and lift to the world. I think at the end of this, or towards the end of this engagement, we'll view a film on a project that I've been working on in Boston called the Faneuil Hall Race and Reconciliation Project. It humbly fits within this tradition of political theology that I mentioned, which again I say is cited in the epistemological understanding of reality of the Black person in the New World, in terms of grafting from the cosmology of the sacred traditions of the Judeo-Christian religion, something for them and something that is transformative. I fit in that tradition. Thank God, thank Jesus, where I seek with others to address the issue of a systemic and structural racism on the ground as it is practiced in Boston. And it's simply about renaming a building that is attached to a slave owner and a person who, Peter Faneuil, who participated in the global trade transactions of the enslaved and reaped money and benefits, but also participated in the dehumanization of people. The practice of renaming as it is being done across the globe as it relates to systemic racism is, of course, about the symbolic renaming, the replacing of old symbols of oppression with new insight. That's very important. But the practice also, the practice also seeks to engage dialogue that extends across the so-called categories of race to extend to how we are all human, and that how we all must address, as they would say in the Bible, the dynamic qualities or inclinations of racism. Jesus spoke to that, and Dr. Scott, you speak to that. You allude to that with the concept of Domindo. My practice and what I seek to articulate in Boston in this simple, very discreet action is to go to those larger categories of emancipation. So I look forward to collecting and gathering responses and reflections from you who view that short film, and I'm happy to follow through responding to any of those questions or reflections or concerns. Thank you, Cuff, for being here, and I'm so grateful again to be part of this panel and to sit with such smart, articulate, and wise people, Yvette and Dr. Scott.
Thank you all for some wonderful thoughts and presentations. I know that we're running a little bit late, but I feel it's important just to continue in the process so that we can at least feel a sense of completion with the whole thought process that's been at play. So I'm going to ask Rich if you would run the film that Kevin was alluding to.
One of Boston's top tourist destinations and a stop on the Freedom Trail. There's some 20 million people that visit Faneuil Hall each year. But how much do you actually know about this historic landmark? We, the New Democracy Coalition, are here to share the full history with you and why we are boycotting Faneuil Hall Marketplace. My name is Jazz, and I'm a member of the coalition. Let's go over to the building and I'll tell you the full history. In the summer of 1740, a wealthy Boston merchant by the name of Peter Faneuil offered to pay for the construction of a centralized public marketplace. 2 years later, this building behind me was erected, and the town decided to name it after him since he paid for it after all. Over the past 275 plus years, there's been many heated meetings, debates, and votes, all that happened inside and outside of Faneuil Hall. During the colonial period, colonists like Sam Adams next to me met here to discuss their grievances against Britain. In the 1900s, the civil rights leader William Monroe Trotter held protests here against lynching. The women's suffrage movement even gained steam right here, inside and outside of the building. With so much protests and debates and meetings here, Faneuil Hall has received the nickname the Cradle of Liberty. But the building was founded in infamy. It was paid with money created from the slave trade, and Africans were sold into a lifetime of slavery all along the Faneuil Hall footprint. There's so much more to share, but let's go over to another part of the building and I'll tell you the history. Quincy Market is part of the Faneuil Hall Marketplace. The building was erected in 1826 in order to give more space to merchants to sell their goods and for shoppers to come and go. It was named after Boston Mayor Josiah Quincy. There's so much more than meets the eye when it comes to Quincy Market and the Faneuil Hall building. Let's go through Quincy Market and I'll tell you some of those details.
Did you know the building of Faneuil Hall started in controversy? There were many colonists, particularly the native-born ones, that did not want a regulated marketplace.
They didn't like anything regulated. They wanted merchants to sell their produce, their eggs, their meat all out in the streets. The town only narrowly approved of the marketplace with 367 yays to 360 nays. Did you know that Faneuil Hall was funded with money from the slave trade?
Peter Faneuil was a merchant that earned his money from the business of slavery and slave trading. He was born in 1700 in New York to parents who were French Huguenot refugees. He came to Boston to apprentice under his uncle Andrew Faneuil, who was a merchant.
He learned the ropes from him, and then he established connections in the Caribbean to both the British and the French slave societies. And he traded with them New England products, items like cod and timber that would support those plantations.
And then he imported into Boston items like molasses, sugar, and Africans to enslave.
He earned his money from that in addition to earning an inheritance from his uncle Andrew Faneuil when he passed away. That money went into constructing Faneuil Hall.
Did you know that Africans were sold into slavery right here Quincy Market sits on top of a landfill that was formerly an area for ships to dock. Africans were sold exactly where I'm standing from the slave ships. Men, women, and children were all sold right here. It's estimated that thousands of Africans were sold where this Quincy Market building is. Between 1638, when the first slave ship, the Desire, arrived in Boston, all the way up to 1783, when the practice of slavery ended in Massachusetts.
This Quincy Market building and the Faneuil Hall building are dynamic tourist attractions that sit on a very dark piece of Boston's history. From this Atlantic Ocean, our African ancestors were brought as cargo to be enslaved. They were victims of the triangle slave trade, from which Peter Faneuil earned his wealth. He was deeply connected to the plantation societies in the Caribbean, from Jamaica to Barbados to Antigua and other islands. I bet you don't think about slavery when you think about Boston, right? It's falsely believed that slavery didn't have a place up in the north. But the truth of the matter is, Boston's 18th century economy was based on the business of slavery, supplying goods to plantations.
And there were Africans that were enslaved here, working in every industry.
People like Peter Faneuil brought Africans here to be enslaved. Peter Faneuil, his slave ship, the Jolly Bachelor, would have docked on this shore. He would have docked here with his commodities, including Africans and other products. We know of at least one journey that ship made to West Africa that was attacked by pirates, according to the historian Jared Hardesty. We also know that Peter Faneuil requested to have a young African boy brought here to Boston to have enslaved to his home. We know this because of his correspondence back in 1738. We also know at the time of his death, there were 5 people that were enslaved to him that were worth over $120,000, according to the appraisal inventory. So should we really be honoring this man's legacy on a publicly owned building in Boston? We, the New Democracy Coalition, say no. Can you imagine people being placed on bar stools, physically examined to be sold into a life of slavery and misery? Well, that's what happened at taverns on streets like these. Africans were sold on bar stools in taverns like the Sun Tavern that was across the street from Faneuil Hall, and the Bunch of Grapes Tavern, which is where the Freemasons held their meetings regularly. Meanwhile, just a hop, skip, and a jump from here, Peter Faneuil lived a life of luxury in a mansion on Beacon Street. Why is his name honored on a public building in Boston? It should not be there. We're back at Faneuil Hall, and it's important for you to know that with the Africans that were sold into slavery all along this footprint, they were sold for around $7,500 today. And that amount exceeds the net worth of a black family in Boston, which is $8 according to a Federal Reserve report in 2015. It's also important for you to know that of the 141 businesses and shops in this Faneuil Hall campus, 0 are black owned. For these reasons and more, residents of Boston have begun to hold protests and boycotts against the Faneuil Hall marketplace. And we have asked the mayor of Boston to hold a hearing in order to discuss changing the name of Faneuil Hall.
But more significant than this, protesters are seeking a hearing where residents across the city can dialogue about racial division and the pathway toward equity.
Just as protesters in cities across the country have successfully removed Confederate statues and monuments that celebrate racial hierarchies, we are trying to do the same in Boston. Peter Faneuil was a white supremacist, and his name should not adorn a public building in Boston. Will you join us in our protests? Will you join us in demanding a hearing from Mayor Marty Walsh? You can join us by signing the change.org petition called Change the Name of Faneuil Hall. And you can also find us online by searching Boycott Faneuil Hall.
Okay. We've kind of run out of our time, but again, I just wanted to, as a way to try to put some closure to our experience, let me just ask each of you maybe to say a word or two in your closing, just so that people can, so you can feel some sense of closure to your conversation with us. Just a word or two, and then we're going to turn it over to Leslie, who's going to be closing us out.
Just a wonderful opportunity on my part, Kevin Peterson here. Wonderful opportunity to have this very, very important conversation, which connects the all the academic work, the work throughout the diaspora with the work of continuing work of freedom and emancipation and democracy.
Thank you, Cuff, for this opportunity, Joyce, to have spoken here and been with this wonderful panel in this forum, which is fantastic. I think that, as I've tried to point out with my work, that this is a global issue. I think that we should really spend more time looking at it globally. I know some people like to think that the United States is not a part of the global world, and we're somehow different, but we are implicated, and this is a very important nation. The issue, as the George Floyd protests around the world and other kinds of impetus from African-American culture have spread around the world and have had an impact. This is a very important issue that we're looking at here, and what we decide about anti-racism, how to rehumanize ourselves on this planet, it will have an effect around the globe. So I believe in this fully, and I'm thankful for the opportunity to be with you and have this forum today. Many thanks. Blessings.
I'm going to go with the word rising, because I'm starting to realize that it may be simple, but for those of us of African descent to get up every day and rise in our truth and rise in our light and rise in our humanity and rise in our love and rise in our intelligence and rise in our sweetness is a task, because it's not set up for us to do so. So for me, as we've talked about undoing racism, we have our challenge, our spiritual and just challenge to keep doing what we're doing. And I challenge those who have joined us today to go back and self-reflect of where you will fit into that challenge and how you will help the rising of all humanity.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Let me just say in my little last remarks here is that in thinking about the whole notion of undoing racism and anti-Black dispositions and so forth, one of the things that many people on the planet don't recognize at the moment is what the Black experience teaches you. And what's interesting about that lesson, it's a lesson about projection. And one of the profound things that we learn is that we are not the projections of others. So every single day, we experience projections onto us, but we are not that projection. And so in part, that profound lesson actually needs to be expanded beyond just black, white. It's really a realization that each of us are engaged in a projective experience. We project out to others who we think they are, and we respond to them that way. Indeed, I may go so far as to say, even in our traditions around spirituality, religion, so forth, we do our own projections. Light dark has also gotten contained in that very language. The God of light, the Prince of darkness. Now that's contained in the psyche. Now, if you embrace that as in the psyche, guess what happens when you entertain the idea of interacting with a person who designates themselves as Black? So I'll leave you with those words. Okay, I'm going to turn it back over to Leslie.
Oh, I'm kind of out of breath from being inside of this experience. And, you know, you so eloquently put in your book, Cuff, about mirrors, about how we are part of mirrors. And I sat, my emotional body was sitting inside the wound as you spoke about it, deeply inside that wound. And I think that schizophrenic lies produce schizophrenic lives. And I think we are sitting inside of that, in how Ashe has been traumatized, and how excited I then get with how we can learn more about Domindo and how do we shift this energy curve in what we're embracing. I was totally blown away by, you know, in the mental mind, about the notion of cognitive justice, you know, that notion of how we hierarchy knowledge, and how much you're blowing open that knowledge in a very different kind of appreciation, acknowledgement, exposure. You know, my physical body is in this moment in time and place, which means that we are in this moment where you are speaking into this truth so powerfully, so elegantly, so, I don't know, it hits me in my heart to know that we are in this moment together, and that I will never understand in this incarnation the conquerors and the colonizers and what they did. I know in other incarnations I do. And I just sit with that schizophrenia that sits inside my own experience, and I'm saddened by it. But then I go to the spiritual domain that you so eloquently speak to, and that's where the superconscious allows us to have a unity, an integration, an awareness of all that is. And we start to see how all of us are fractals in this moment, where we can lend into the rewriting of humanity, the arising of humanity. And you know, some of us are going to stumble and fall as we do this. And when love is in play, we are picked up and held again and move on and go forward. So this was an amazing, beautiful symphony of truth. And I really want to thank you on behalf of Humanity Rising, all those thousands of people who are out there and have been enlightened, moved. My hope is moved to action on this agenda. It is up to us, and I know I'm there with you. So thank you so much, Yvette and Cuff and Joyce and Kevin. A beautiful piece of work today. Thank you. I do want to make sure that you click on the after chat because I think there are going to be some real more questions about, okay, tell us more. If you can invest a little bit of time, it will be so much appreciated. And that way we get to interact with you and you can see the faces that have been behind the chat. And as I wrap up today's session, I just want to make sure that you are invited, all one and all, to tomorrow's session, which is the third in a series celebrating the life of Stan Groff, who's going to be turning 90 on July 1st. And in this third episode, we're going to go more into the holotropic breathing work that he has done. And I thought it's interesting because you speak so eloquently, Cuff, about that super consciousness. And he's been working all his life in that consciousness state and into the unimaginable elements of consciousness that we can access. And when we do, how we can find other life forms within us. And so that's going to be tomorrow. And he's going to be joined by a great panel, including his brother, who took the biology version of mental illness, and they came back to the same conclusion. Stan did the psychology, Paul did the biology, and they realized that they both came back to the same place. It's about consciousness. So I do want to invite everybody to come and enjoy Stan, his wife Bridget, and a wonderful panel tomorrow. And so with that, I wish you deep blessings, deep blessings, gratitude, and we're out.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Let's see.
All right.
Great job, guys. I was enthralled. I was like, oh my gosh, this could go on forever. Please make it go on forever.
Leslie, when Joyce and I were talking about this, we were saying probably could use a whole week, to do this.